And now I'd like to introduce our presenter for this evening, Candace Simpson. Candace is a longtime gardener and an amazing teacher. Every time I spend time with Candace, I learn something new. She's been a very active UC Master Gardener volunteer since 2003.
Okay. Okay, folks, welcome. I'd like to again say what Edith just said is that we would appreciate your keeping your microphones and your videos off. I can see you all if your video is on and you're on top of my slides, so it makes things a little difficult. Welcome to this class. When I teach this class in person, I always ask people how many of them have clay, and of course we have made it clear that this class is about clay, and we're hoping that all of you that are here with us are here because you either already love your Santa Clara County clay or you can't imagine loving your Santa Clara County clay and you want to find out what's behind it. So we're going to assume that you all have clay soil. And I know that a lot of you probably wish that you had anything but clay soil, that you think anything but it would be better. But tonight what I hope to do is persuade you that your clay soil is absolutely the best soil that you could ask for a vegetable garden or for growing Mediterranean ornamental plants and fruit trees. It is a very water retentive soil, as you know. I'm sure that those of you that have it would say it's way too water retentive. Sometimes it seems like it will never drain. And there is a fix for that, and we will cover that tonight. It's also a very fertile soil. There's a reason why this valley was called the Valley of Heart's Delight. So this is a area that is known for agriculture, and the soil is what contributed to that reputation for Santa Clara Valley. So all we need to know is how to work with it properly, and you can get all the benefits of it without any of the headaches. We're going to talk mostly about how to handle it in the vegetable garden, but I am, toward the end of the evening, I am going to talk a little bit about waterwise ornamental plants, annual flowers, and fruit trees also, so that you know what the slight differences are with growing those in clay. So here we go. Oops, why do you not want to go? So the first question then is, what is soil? So just to make sure we're all on the same page with this is a picture of a road cut somewhere. I think it's in Europe. But to me, it looks like clay soil, and I think you might agree with me on that. It's quite a deep layer of soil that we're looking at here. Soil is the thin layer on the very top of the earth that is, or the very top of the planet, that is capable of supporting plant life. That is the definition of soil. It is mostly weathered minerals, and of course those weathered minerals, what the actual constituents are depends on the location of the soil and what the rocks and minerals are that are in that area. It also has decaying plant and animal matter in it to different extents in different places. And it has a lot of living matter in it also, a lot of living insects and crustaceans and so forth, as well as, of course, plants living in it. Lastly, it has air and water in it. It has pore space in it, and those pores are filled either with air or water. So that's what constitutes soil. And it is the specific minerals that are in that soil and the size of the particles that determines the behavior of the soil. So the three types of particles, that these are all familiar words to you, that are able to support plant life are sand, silt, and clay. And this picture, and so this is what the body of soil is. It's either sand or silt or clay or a mixture of those. This picture is meant to show you the relative size of a single particle of sand to silt to clay. So you start with that yellow circle that is meant to represent a single grain of sand. And yes, sand does have a range of sizes, but just think of an ordinary grain of sand on the beach, and that is that big yellow circle. Silt is represented by that small brown circle, so you can see that that is quite a bit smaller. If you can kind of picture yourself looking at a handful of sand grains and just think about how many silt particles would be represented by that if they were to take the place. But really what we're talking about tonight is clay. And you see here how very small clay is in relationship to a grain of sand. Clay particles are actually microscopic. And that means in the size of a particle determines the size of the spaces between those particles when it is in a collection. So in a handful of clay, you have these teeny microscopic particles, and the spaces between those particles are also microscopic. Now, just to make you feel a little bit better, if you think, oh, no wonder water won't go in or it won't come out or whatever, there could be 10,000 water molecules across the diameter of a clay particle. 10,000 of them. So we're not talking about molecular size, but we are talking microscopic size. Okay, so clay has this quality of being in such fine particles, and that determines a lot of its properties. So if the pore space is that small, you can imagine that water is going, and plant roots and fertilizer dissolved in water that you put on it, it all has to work its way very relatively slowly through the clay. If you pictured something like a tall pipe filled with sand and you poured a cup of water on that sand, it would go straight through and out of the bottom of the pipe in no time, because sand doesn't hold water at all. It just flows right through. If you picture that pipe filled with clay and you poured the water on it, it would take a long time for that water to appear at the bottom of that column of clay. That is because of the small size of the particles and another characteristic of clay particles, and that is that they have an uneven distribution of charge. I'm not going to belabor this, but if you remember your middle school science and maybe your chemistry, you will remember that we have positive charges. Some things are positively charged, some things are negatively charged, and opposite charges are attracted to each other. So clay has this unusual situation that an individual particle is not charged, but the charge on it is uneven. The surface is negative and the center is positive. So when water flows near that or comes near a clay particle, water also it's neutral overall, but one end of it is positive, slightly positive, and the other end is slightly negative. This means that that slightly positive side of water can be attracted to that negative surface of the clay and held by that opposite charge. So this is the reason that clay is so very, very water, holding on to water. Now, as gardeners, holding on to water is a good thing for us. We want the water that we put onto our garden beds to stay in the root zone as long as possible so that the plants can draw it up. At the same time, we don't want it to fill up all the pore space in the soil so that the roots can't also get air, because the roots also need to be able to access air. So we need to have a garden soil that holds on to water, but also drains, so that about half the pore space is filled with air and half the pore space is filled with water. Okay, so that's what we're going for. Excuse me. So now we need to talk about how clay soil actually functions with that very small pore space. That very small pore space can be a problem because of the difficulty of water getting into it and then moving out of it once it's in there. That is even more difficult. So the other problem is that roots may have a hard time making their way through those tiny, tiny pore spaces that we have in clay. So we are going to need to do something to enable water and plant roots to be able to get in and through that clay soil better, in spite of the tiny size of those particles and therefore the tiny size of the pore space. This tendency to hold on to water is what makes clay, turns clay into that sticky mass when it's really wet, the kind that won't come off the shovel when you've gotten it into it. So we're going to show you tonight how we can deal with that. Before we do that, I just want to show you how soil scientists will look at different kinds of soils. When I ask people what kind of soil is the best for garden, they usually say loam. And this diagram that you see here, again, kind of overly complicated, it shows you that loam is really just a mixture of clay, silt, and sand. Those three particles that I told you about that form the soil that can support plant life. So very fine clay, pretty fine silt, and coarse sand combined in different proportions give you different kinds of soil. You can see from the top part of this diagram, the blue triangle that you're looking at, that those are the high percents of clay, and that whole top part is labeled clay. So it's considered that I'll see if I can help you with this. Here you see the percent clay lines are running this way across this diagram. So this is a line that represents 60% clay. Everything above 40% clay, at least most of it, is labeled a clay soil. But if you get a little below that, you start to get all kinds of interesting names. You have sandy clay, you have silty clay, you have clay loam. Sorry. You have silty clay loam and sandy clay loam and sandy loam and loamy sand. And so it all depends on the proportion of that soil that is comprised of each of these three types of particles that make up soil. Okay. We in Santa Clara County are pretty much right in here. So some of you probably have clay loam. You might be at the top of it. My soil is right in here. It's about 45% clay. And it feels like it's 100% clay. But I'm going to show you something tonight that is the way a scientist would give you a quick and dirty answer to how much clay you had. So we're going to go to that next. The issue, to come back to it, is that now that we know that we have this clay soil, how are we going to improve drainage in that clay soil? How are we going to increase the pore spaces in our clay soil so that plant roots and water and nutrients have an easier time getting through it? And that depends on this characteristic of soil called soil structure. So soil can be formed into different sort of large units. I'm going to go back here. Forgive me, I'm going to have to go back slide by slide, but I want to go back to this picture. So this road cut, if you look at the way that soil looks from the top to the bottom, I think you can see that at the top about 1/6 of that full profile looks pretty fine grained. And then there's another 1/6 that looks almost like it's in layers, thinner layers. And then finally below that, another 1/6 looks like kind of medium-sized chunky stuff. And below that, very large chunks to almost all blending together. Okay, remember that. The granular on top, the platey, the layered looking stuff, and then different sizes of blocks. So now I'm going to go back here. And those are all what we refer to as different soil structures. So soil, granular soil is small bits of soil, irregularly shaped, but usually rounded off. And the whole soil body is kind of composed of those. Doesn't mean they won't stick together, but they actually separate into that kind of a small shapes if you are able to break it up. The one just below it you see is called platy, and I think that was what the second layer was that we saw in that road cut. That tends to happen when soil is compacted by being weighted down with vehicles. If you dug up the soil beneath a parking lot, you can see this kind of platy structure because the soil is compacted into layers. The other one I want you to look at, I'm not going to talk about wedges and prismatic. We don't have that. That isn't of interest right now, is the blocky ones. So some of them are kind of rounded off blockies and others are more angular blocks. And those are two other forms that any kind of soil can shape itself into. Now we're not gonna go into why it happens, but I want to show you, I want you to picture in your own mind which of these you think would be the easiest for plant roots to get through. Thinking about plants sending these tiny little roots down when they're first getting started, and they're just localized, but the plant needs them to be able to go in all directions as well as down in order to cover the largest area to gather water and nutrients for the plant. Which of these do you think would be the easiest for that? I hope what you're thinking is the granular structure, because in every direction, the roots will find crevices and openings where they can proliferate. Easier definitely than the platy, where there's going to be layers that are hard to break through, and easier than the blocky because the blocky is much bigger. So I want to show you, I'm going to get out of the PowerPoint now and show you instead whoop, that's not right. Okay, hang on here.
That looks good, Candace. Maybe a little bit further down.
Okay, I can't see it for some reason. So I'm not going to be, so you're going to have to coach me, all right?
Yeah, if you could point the camera a little further down towards the plate. Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, all right. So just feel free to holler if you can't see. Okay. So I went out in my yard and I tried to find a place where there was unamended clay. And I did find a couple of places. My front yard is pretty much unamended clay. I needed to find a place where, even though it was unamended clay, it had enough moisture in it that I could get a shovel into it. As you know, when clay is completely dry, as it is if it's hasn't been irrigated this time of year, it can be impossible to dig. So I did find a place where I'm ashamed to say I've been allowing water to overflow from some containers that are being watered there automatically. And so I was able to find some chunks of unamended clay that were still somewhat moist. So I think you can see, I hope you can see that you can see the tree roots or the fine roots that were growing down. I had to go pretty deep to get these pieces. But this is clay and it is moist, but not soaking wet. So it's not going to be that the thing you can make pots out of, but neither is it going to be iron hard. And you can see that at this level of moisture, clay can be crumbled. So that clay that you might have tried to dig into and you found just couldn't be dug at all, actually can be crumbled pretty easily if it's at the right level of moisture. This second chunk is actually a little more moist than that one. That one's been sitting in my laundry room drying out for a few days since I dug it, but this one I dug today. And if you see this, how easily this breaks apart. And I hope that you're seeing that it really is a kind of a homogeneous soil, except for the few plant roots that are in there. It's clay, okay? Now, I want to show you how we might be able to keep this clay from going back to these sticky chunks. First, I want to make you believe that this truly is sticky clay. And if it were wet enough, it would be that sticky clay that you know and love. So I've got this crumbled up here. And I'm going to put a little extra water on it from this spray bottle. It won't take much. And then I'll work it with my hand. I should have done that with my left hand, but that's okay. And you can see that that indeed is clay. Okay, so scientists, soil scientists have a simple field test that they do that allows them to tell you approximately how much clay you have in your soil. And that is by, I'm going to move this out of the way here. Bring a relatively empty plate here for this purpose. So, and that's called the ribbon test. And what you do is just make a cast like this. The first thing they do is look to see if these fingerprints will stay in the cast. That tells them that there is definitely quite a lot of clay in there. But then they make a ribbon by forcing out the clay like this. And I'm not great at it. They try to make it as thin as they can, and I can't make it that thin. And they watch for cracks like this and how long that ribbon can get before that clay will fall off from its own weight. And so this one was about 2 inches long when it fell off. And they can actually estimate from that how much clay is in there. The more clay that is in there, the longer that ribbon can get without breaking. So you can actually try this on your soil in your garden. You have to dig down past anything that you have amended, because you want to get to the native soil. And so if it's a place where you've planted anything, you're going to have to go a ways down. But it is kind of fun to do, to find that native clay and then figure out about how much clay you have. And you can also find videos on YouTube that show that ribbon test being done. Okay, now I'm going back to my wet lump here and breaking it up, because I want to show you this trick. The question is, we all know what this is like. We want to know how we can take this clay soil and not have that happen to it. So I'm going to get a little bit more of this soil here. And I'm going to break it up. And you're to imagine that this breaking up is you forking your soil in the garden. So you get the clay at the right level of moisture and you use a digging fork or something, and or a shovel or whatever it is you use normally to dig your clay, and you break it up as I have broken up this little thing here. And then you add to that about 1/3 as much compost as you have soil. And the directions we give are, you fork it to a depth of 1 foot, and then you add 4 inches of compost if it's unamended, if it has been unamended in the previously. So you put in that much compost and you mix it with your fork. You sift it into that soil so that it's mixed in. I'm pulling out little rocks and things here as I go. So it's mixed into the clay. I think this one needs a little bit more. Okay, so now the question is, with this compost in here, if I do the same thing, if I add water to it, and then I compact it again, will it stick together in a sticky mass? And you can see that it will not. The compost is keeping the clay from going back together into that sticky mass that is so hard to work with. So the solution, I'm going to put this aside here and give me a moment to get most of this off my hands.
Candace, we had one question from Ursula. And she asked, can you tell us what % of clay is in different parts of the South Bay, like the western part or the eastern foothills, etc.?
You know, you would not believe how complicated that is. There have been soil surveys done by the US Department of Agriculture, and they are incredibly detailed, the maps of the soil. But you can look in, you can find that information, put in your zip code and see exactly what percentage clay you have in your soil. I don't know whether whether Sharon or Edith will be able to find that tonight, but we definitely have it. And I'm sure you can find it if you Google it. I say percentage clay in 94306. And I bet you anything it'll come up in Google. At least try that, and that will tell you. I can't tell you specific levels of clay. I did look at the old survey that was done way back in the 40s, and it has a list of all the places that they tested clay and tested the soil, and it's just clay, clay, clay loam, clay silt, clay this, clay that, clay this. You know, it's all clay. There are sandy soils in some parts of. There are sandy soils in some parts, and there are loamy soils in some parts. And a few people have silty soil if they are in a creek bed, an old creek bed. But I can't tell you a specific place. I'm sorry about that. Okay.
Great, thanks so much.
I'm going to try to go back to my screen share here. And back to the slideshow. Okay, so I hope you were persuaded by that, but it's kind of difficult to be persuaded by a little bit of clay on a plate. The real proof would be if you went out into your garden and you tried this in your garden. So if you have some unamended soil that you're trying to turn into a garden, there are these simple steps. First, dig at the right level of moisture. If you can't get the fork in, it's too dry. If the fork goes in and won't come out, it's too wet. this is a great time to be thinking about this because we're going to start to have rain soon. And you can let those first rains soften the soil and then just keep checking and see when it's right at the point where indeed you can stick a fork in like you see in this picture. And when you start to bring it up, you get these clumps, big chunks of soil, but it will fall off the fork and you can break those up by smashing them with a fork or tossing them a bit. So once you have it broken down into reasonable sized chunks, you amend it with compost. So you put the compost on and you sift it in. I like a digging fork for all this work because it's easier to sift things in. It's also easier to get it in and out of the clay than it is a shovel. But if you don't have a digging fork, a spade or a shovel will do fine. So you put in, as I said, you're going to try to dig it 12 inches down. You put in cover it with a layer of 4 inches of compost, and then just work at sifting that in. And thereafter, be sure you do not recompact the soil by walking on your beds, because if even the best amended soil, if you walk on it, that you will be pushing those clay particles back together in places, and eventually you will recompact it. So those are your three steps. Okay. Now we talked about compost being what we add here. Therefore, we call it an amendment. We are amending the soil with it. I want to distinguish with you between that and fertilizing, which I am going to deal with a little bit later. Okay, so once you have done that, once you have loosened the clay soil and stirred in the compost, mixed in the compost, you actually will have elevated that area a little bit, because you've now got a lot more large air spaces in there because of having dug the clay and the particles being, chunks being sizable. And you've also added that compost. So you will have elevated that area, and you have in effect created a type of a raised bed. So I like to call it a mounded bed, because people think of raised beds as being something that's surrounded by something to hold it in place. But this has a lot of the advantages of raised beds. So a raised bed will warm up faster in the spring because the soil is lifted up out a little bit of the larger soil body. So it's going to be easier to warm it up. It'll have better water infiltration because, again, it's been kind of lifted out. It's got a looser structure for plant roots to move through. So in every way, these raised beds have a lot of advantages. One that people often don't think of is it's also the best reminder of where you shouldn't be walking. So we don't want you to recompact the soil that you've dug. So a raised bed gives you a really clear delineation of where you should not be walking, if at all possible. There can be low raised beds. I'm not sure how low these really are, but there are now, it's very popular to have very high raised beds like this to make it more accessible. But whether if it's low like this, you might be able to fill it just with your by loosening the native soil. Maybe if you're making pathways like have been made in this garden, you could put some of that excavated soil in there as well. If the sides are not higher than 6 to 8 inches, you can fill them with native soil amended with compost. If you do make higher raised beds, you are going to need to fill that with a special soil mix that has very little actual soil. It's going to be mostly non-soil amendments like compost and potting soil, which is essentially compost. But many garden centers now are offering a soil mix that has some real soil in it because of the advantages of the real soil that I've already enumerated. It will hold water better if you have some actual mineral soil in there, especially if it's clay. and it is more fertile. So it will hold on to nutrients better because the nutrients are dissolved in the water. So that means it's going to hold on to nutrients. And clay actually holds on to a lot of nutrients because of its electrical charge as well. So these tall raised beds are not something that you are going to really be treating in the ways that we're talking tonight because they are not filled with clay soil. But the mounded beds and the low raised beds very easily can be clay soil. Okay, so this is what we're looking for here. Before we go on from this, I would like to see if you can remember the 3 important things to remember about working clay soil in a vegetable bed. You're not going to type this into the chat. I just want you to try to remember it there. I told you there were 3 ways that you handled the soil, 3 things that you did in order to create the right structure for a vegetable bed in clay soil. See if you can remember those. I'll just give you a few seconds. So here are those 3 things. If you remembered them, give yourself a big pat on the back. If you didn't, jot them down quickly or jot down the one that you didn't get or whatever so that you can remember that. This is extremely important if you want to be able to tap all the advantages of clay soil for vegetables. Okay, so we are ready to talk about fertilizer. And I want to start by explaining why all that wonderful compost that you just put into the clay soil is not what I mean by fertilizer. It is an absolutely essential part of the garden, as I have just explained, especially if you are amending you working with clay soil. But compost is plant material that has disintegrated, decayed, down to this wonderful material that does have all the elements in it that plants need because it's made of plants after all. But it doesn't have, it doesn't break down easily further. So it's not going to be easy for that compost to release those plant nutrients that it has within it to your soil. Now, if you are growing vegetables or annual flowers, these are things that we want to push to grow really fast and to produce, in the case of vegetables, all the way through completely ripe, ready fruits like tomatoes and squashes and peppers in a single season. And that means that we have to give those plants the nutrients they need quickly, they have to be readily available, and they have to have them in good supply when they need them. Compost is simply too slow to release any of the nutrients that it has, and too low in many of the nutrients to be able to be a good fertilizer. It's invaluable as the amendment for clay soil, but it is not useful as a fertilizer for annual vegetables. So that being said, let me talk about what all plants need, no matter whether they're annual vegetables or redwood trees. All plants need 17 different chemical elements in order to reach their full potential, let's say, to grow and mature. And those chemical elements are circled in different colors or boxed in different colors here in this picture of the periodic table. I always kid that I was a chemistry teacher in my working life, and so I always have to find a way to get a periodic table into my gardening talks. But anyway, here it is. It's really justified in this case. So you'll see a key down at the bottom of this slide. The ones that are circled in green, which are hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, are all taken from water or air. So hydrogen from the water, oxygen from the water, carbon from the carbon dioxide in the air, oxygen from the oxygen in the air. So all of those three come from the air or water. The three that are boxed in gold, which are nitrogen, phosphorus, and then over here, potassium. Those are called the primary nutrients because they are the ones that all plants need in the largest amounts. And they are needed in much larger amounts than the other nutrients. So these are the ones that we really worry about in our soil and that we especially look for in the fertilizers that we apply. The ones in blue are these called secondary. They are very important. You've certainly heard about calcium and magnesium needed for our plants, as well as sulfur. Maybe not, you haven't heard so much about sulfur, but it's also a secondary nutrient. So those are also needed. And the red ones are micronutrients. So they're needed, but in very small amounts, very small amounts. All of the ones except the three that come from the air or water must be in the soil. That is how they are delivered to plants, through the root system. It's true that you can use some foliar fertilizers for some of the micronutrients, but the best way for plants to get all their nutrients is through their roots. And definitely the major and the secondary nutrients, you can't get enough of them through the foliage of a plant to feed a plant through that method. So these things all have to be in the soil. Now, here's the really wonderful news. All of these, except one, are in our clay soil in Santa Clara County in abundance. That's why it is considered such a fertile soil. It's true that you might have a different soil. Some of us may live on properties where the soil was trucked in from somewhere and it didn't come from Santa Clara County. But the vast majority of us in Santa Clara County, our soil has all 14 of the nutrients that plants need to get from the soil already in our clay soil, all but one, and that one is nitrogen. So when we buy fertilizers, this is a picture of a boxed organic fertilizer that's readily available. And you see at the very bottom of that box, there are three numbers, 4, 5, and 3. Those are the percentages of the primary nutrients in that fertilizer. So when all three of those numbers are not 0, we call it a complete fertilizer. Now, I just told you that your soil, your clay soil, our clay soils in this county have phosphorus and potassium, P and K, in abundance. It won't hurt your garden, however, to use this kind of fertilizer. You're adding something that you probably don't really need, but it's come packaged with the nitrogen, which you do really need. So you can get a fertilizer, you can get chemical fertilizers or synthetic fertilizers, which I'll talk about in a minute, that are only one nutrient because they're manufactured. So they can easily be manufactured to have only one nutrient. They are basically chemicals. It's very difficult to get an organic fertilizer that is only one nutrient because organic fertilizers, or as I like to call them in a very wordy way, plant, animal, and mind fertilizers, are natural products. So if alfalfa, for example, which you see in the picture on the left at the bottom, is a plant. And alfalfa as a plant, when it's dried and turned into pellets like that, it's still pure alfalfa. But the plant needed all 17 of those nutrients in order to make itself. So all 17 of those nutrients are in that alfalfa. it's very difficult to get a single nutrient, plant or animal-based fertilizer, because plants and animals have all those nutrients inside them, inside their bodies. Okay. Mined fertilizers are somewhat different. I've included them here. You see green sand there on the left and soft phosphate at the top. Those are mined products, and they're considered organic fertilizers. That's why I put those three things together. Organic fertilizers are just fertilizers that have been minimally processed from their natural state. And that means they're a plant product or an animal product, or they're a just mined and ground up product. A synthetic fertilizer is a manufactured product. So on the right, you see three that you might be familiar with. Miracle-Gro, Osmocote, which is a delayed release pelletized chemical fertilizer, and a sort of a standard citrus mix, which is a mix of fertilizers. So if you're going to mix chemicals together to make your fertilizer, you can put anything in it you want. If you're going to have a plant, animal, or mined fertilizer, it's going to be what it is, and you aren't going to be able to change it. Your plants need the elemental nutrients. They don't absorb alfalfa. They absorb the elements that are in alfalfa after the alfalfa has been broken down in the soil. So you might say, well, then it doesn't matter which I use. You can use chemical fertilizers, you can use organic fertilizers. It doesn't make a difference. It doesn't make a difference in terms of the nutrients being available to your plants, but it makes a difference in other ways. So plant and animal-based fertilizers, most of them, are slow release by nature. That is, they have to be broken down by bacteria and fungi in the soil into their elemental parts so that plants can take them up. So they are, therefore that takes time. So they're slow release. Being slow release and being naturally, most of them, again, not every one, but many of them, being naturally lower concentrations of these nutrients, they are unlikely to be overused and to burn your plants. So they're easier on your plants. They're safer for you to use, I would say that. They are less likely to be applied so much that they are going to wash out of the soil and potentially pollute our waterways or our groundwater. And that is a serious problem for farmers. If they use these very soluble synthetic fertilizers, the irrigation water they will all dissolve immediately. They'll be ready for the plants to take up, but if there's extra, they may wash down below where the plants can draw them out, and therefore they can end up in the groundwater or run off into streams. And that is a serious problem. It can be a problem in the suburbs too. If people over fertilize their lawns and then water them, that fertilizer can run off the lawn and get into our waterways from the suburbs too. So you don't want to overuse fertilizer. So there are some real advantages. And the big one is they're renewable. Plant and animal-based fertilizers are renewable materials, except for the mined ones. But alfalfa, grow another crop of alfalfa. Seabird guano, the seabirds will make more guano. Manure would also fall in this category of an animal fertilizer, animal-based fertilizer. The animals will make more manure for you. So they are renewable materials, whereas either the materials themselves that go into the fertilizers or the fuels that need to be used is done in the factories that manufacture them, those are not necessarily renewable materials. So there are definitely reasons, if you're interested in being more sustainable, for thinking about using plant and animal-based fertilizers. Okay.
Candace, we have a couple of questions. I wonder if you might want to answer.
Oh yeah, for sure.
One is somebody asked, can synthetic fertilizer cause cancer?
I have, well, they're chemicals. And they can't, I think a safe answer is they do not, I have never heard of a fertilizer causing cancer. That's number one. Number two, used as directed, it's hard to imagine how they would cause cancer. They certainly wouldn't cause cancer in the process of going into the soil and being absorbed by the plants and then you taking the plants and eating them. No, they definitely would not. If you inhaled a lot of one, I mean, I can't say, that's too broad a question to answer easily, but used as they are intended to be used, no, they do not cause cancer.
Okay. Yeah. Another question was, can crop rotation help build nutrients in your soil?
Crop rotation cannot help build nutrients in the soil, but it can change the pace of using nutrients in the soil. I am going to talk at the end about cover crops briefly, and a cover crop can be a crop that you grow, is a crop that you grow to benefit the soil. And you can grow cover crops that actually fix nitrogen from the air. And if you grow those cover crops and then chop them up and put them in the ground, they will release that nitrogen to the soil, and you have essentially created your own fertilizer from the air. So, but the rotation of crops is more done for issues related to soil-borne diseases and how hard the crops are drawing on the fertility of the soil. So crops are like in Iowa, there's a standard rotation of soybeans and corn, soybeans and corn, soybeans and corn. Not a whole lot better than just corn, 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 or soybeans, 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 but it is a rotation. And they do that because soybeans do not draw nitrogen from the soil. They create their own nitrogen from the atmosphere because they are a legume. So that's the kind of plant that can do that. Whereas corn needs a lot of nitrogen in the soil. So the corn is really a hard draw on the fertility of the soil. The soybean is not. So they rotate it for that reason. But you can't actually create fertilizer in the soil except by chopping in a leguminous plant at the right time. I'll talk about that later.
And the last question is, so should we put in the plant or animal fertilizer like alfalfa in the garden now so it has time to decompose in the soil?
It starts, one of the beauties of these plant-based fertilizers like alfalfa is that they last a long time in the soil because they are slowly decomposed. So you will get the nutrients out of them slowly over a long period of time. It starts as soon as you put it in, but of course it's slow because of it goes through this process of bacterial or fungal digestion in order to release it in the form that plants can get. It's not a bad idea if you're using that kind of a fertilizer, to put it in maybe a week or two before you put your plants in. But you really don't have to put it in sooner than that. Now, I did find out, I tried soy meal as an alternative to alfalfa. It's much higher in nitrogen. That seemed like a good thing. You have to use a lot of alfalfa, but it's fairly inexpensive for a small garden. But soy, because alfalfa is about 2% nitrogen, soy is 7%, 7 or 7.5% nitrogen. And so I thought I would try it. After I tried it and my plants didn't do very well, I found out that soy has a tendency to give off a lot of its nitrogen very quickly. And it actually, I think, gave it off too soon. And later in the season, I felt I had to fertilize my plants again. Whereas with alfalfa, if I put enough in the beginning, it seems to, I'm thinking about the summer garden now, by the way. It seems to last through most of the summer. So in answer to sum that up and answer your question, not a bad idea to put it in a week or two early, but you don't have to put it in much earlier than that. You certainly wouldn't want to put it in now for your summer garden. I would say when you get your soil ready in the summer, you could put your alfalfa in and plan on planting about 2 weeks later.
And the last question is it possible to put too much alfalfa in the soil?
Well, if you ended up with all alfalfa, you wouldn't have much clay there to hold on to the water or the nutrients. Alfalfa has has very little phosphorus in it. Sorry, not phosphorus, potassium, has very little potassium in it. So I suppose if you almost ended up with, you were growing in alfalfa, wet alfalfa instead of soil, that would be too much. I routinely double what I think is the right amount, and I don't worry about it because I know it's going to break down slowly and it's not going to hurt anything. But I wouldn't use more than about a pound or two per square meter in your garden. I think that's enough. There's no reason to do more. As it breaks down, if the plants can't use it, it will just be washed out of the soil, just like anything else. Okay? Okay, all right. So we are going to go on. I want to ask you another question that I talked about. And that is this one, because this comes up so often in our classes. So I want to see if you remember the explanation I gave for why we say compost is a wonderful thing to add to your garden, but it is not a sufficient fertilizer for annual vegetables. So think back and see if you remember that. Okay, and this was a kind of a long-winded version of it. This is why. It doesn't have enough nitrogen. It doesn't provide it fast enough. Even if you were to put in a lot of compost, way more than we recommended, it can't provide it fast enough to sustain your annual vegetables. Okay, so use it for the purpose that it is perfect for, but don't count on it to fertilize your vegetables. Now, sometimes people have a wonderful first-year garden and they say, but I only use compost. I didn't put anything else in it. Well, our soils do have a lot. As I said, our soils are very, very fertile. And depending on what you grew and how much that soil has been irrigated, there may be a lot of residual nutrients in that soil. I think there's a real truth to beginner's luck in vegetable gardening, because usually you're starting a new garden in a place that hasn't been gardened year after year after year, and the soil isn't exhausted. But annual vegetables really, really do take a lot out of your soil. And so every year you want to add a little more compost. Like after that initial 4-inch, you want to add another inch at least every year, maybe 2 inches if you feel like it's feeling a little too tight, the soil. You'll get so you can tell. Like I know now that my beds do not need compost for about 5 years. I have really put in a lot. But even at our demonstration garden, we can go from bed to bed and we can see that the soil is different in the different beds depending on how much compost has been put in. So put in an inch of compost every year and put in the nitrogen fertilizer at the right amount for what you're planning to grow. And remember, it's really only the nitrogen that you need. You don't really need a complete fertilizer. Okay, so now we're going to switch from vegetables and we're going to just talk very briefly about the other things that many of us grow in our gardens and whether the same things about clay soil apply to them. So many of us grow, especially since our spectacular experiences with drought in the last decade or so, many of us are growing more and more Mediterranean plants, Mediterranean perennials and shrubs, or California native plants. And these are plants that are very well adapted to our kind of clay soil. So again, they're adapted to this soil. They are perennials. You're not forcing them to grow to their mature size in 1 year. In fact, you want them to grow slowly, but steadily and sort of fill the space you've allotted for them. If you make them grow too fast and get really big, you're just going to have more pruning and maintenance to do. So you just want to have them stay healthy, keep growing, get to the size you want them to be, and then their maximum size. This is why you want to plant them at the correct spacing as opposed to filling in right away. And then you will have a beautiful landscape that's very well adapted to our clay soil and to low irrigation. So when you are planting these types of plants, you do not amend the soil. You don't want, you're not going to be digging this area over and over. It's never going to be dug again until you have to replace that plant after some, we hope, long number of years. So we don't want a soil that necessarily drains quickly. So we're not going to put compost in there. These plants are used to clay. They're suitable for clay. And so they will be happy in that clay soil, and you will have to water less because you have not amended the soil and it's not so quick draining. You also are going to use minimal or even no fertilizer because again, these plants are growing slowly. They're not growing from a tomato seed to 70 pounds of tomatoes in one summer. They are just having slow, steady growth. So they can get the nutrients that they need from what is in the soil. And the mulch, I'm going to talk about mulch in a minute, the mulch that you can put on top of the soil. If you put an organic mulch up there like wood chips or rough compost or something like that, that will slowly decompose at the soil surface and release small amounts of nutrients into the soil. That and our naturally fertile clay soil will make these plants very happy. So you don't amend the soil and you use minimal or no fertilizer. Particularly when you're planting shrubs or something like that that have a sizable root ball on them, you especially don't want to amend the soil then because the compost that you would use to amend will eventually decompose and that plant will sink into that hole farther. And that is not a good situation. You want it to stay up with its crown well above the soil line. So these are all plants that are or were at the Palo Alto demonstration garden, waterwise garden. I know some of you have probably been out to see us recently at our open gardens. These are, and we also have a demonstration garden in San Jose at Marshall Cottle Park. Please get on our website, look up demonstration gardens, find those gardens if you're interested in going out and seeing native and Mediterranean perennials and shrubs that can be used really well in our native clay soil with minimum irrigation and minimum fertilizer. Annuals are a different story. And these bedding plants that we use for color in our gardens, these annual flowers, Here you see stock and violas, and there's probably some other stuff in the back. These are things, these are plants that you do want to have grow. They really only have 1 year of life. They will go from seed to seed in one cycle, one season. They will not come back unless they reseed. So these are plants that you need to grow rapidly and to be healthy, to have everything that they need in order to grow quickly and get all the way to their flowering stage. So in this case, for annual flower beds, you would amend the soil with compost. Probably not as much as you're putting into your annual vegetable beds, but definitely enough to lighten it up so that the water, movement of water in there will be good, because you're going to have to water these more too than you would with our Mediterranean plants. So do amend the soil with compost, and do add a little bit of fertilizer. Again, they're doing their whole shot in one season, so they do need the nutrients available to do that. They can't afford to grow slowly for 3 or 4 years. Okay. So this is different. And then the last example is fruit trees. This is a picture of a bare root fruit tree being planted. I'm sure this is very familiar to a lot of you. The old advice about planting bare root fruit trees is completely gone. We now know that, especially in our clay soil here in California, fruit trees do better if they are planted in unamended soil. You do not amend the soil or add fertilizer at the time. So no compost, no fertilizer when you bare root plant in January or so. You dig a hole that is no deeper than that root system. You know, my dad, you know, when he taught me how to plant trees, it was dig a really deep and a really wide hole. Well, that is no longer the case, because if you dig a deep hole, as that soil settles, even if you don't amend it, as that soil resettles from water constantly going through it, that tree is going to sink. And a tree sinking is a very bad situation. The trees are very sensitive at the point where the trunk goes into the soil. We have a lot of fungal diseases. We have several fungal diseases that are very common here in California, that that's the prime situation for them to attack a tree. If the root crown, the place where the trunk enters the soil, if that area is constantly wet, as it would be if the tree sank because of water flowing down into that depression, that is an invitation to disease. And so a shallow hole so that the tree will not go, in fact, you want to plant it a little bit higher. But as far as our soils are concerned, no amendments, because again, amendments will decompose and that will cause sinking as well. The other issue with adding amendments to the planting hole for a tree, even if you dig the hole the right depth and wide enough to accommodate all the roots, if you add amendments to the soil that you backfill with, you've got this nice, loose, soft soil, and the tree will send out its new fine roots through that easy to penetrate soil. And it is possible that when it hits the native soil out at the perimeter of your hole, they will not be able to move into that heavier soil. They will instead just proliferate in the area where it's been amended. And that means that the root system will be very small in diameter as the tree grows, and that will lead to an instability. So you want those roots to it's tough love. They have to get out into that native soil as soon as possible. So by making the whole planting soil nothing but natives, the whole planting hole, nothing but native soil, those roots will, from the get-go, be reaching out away, looking for water and nutrients throughout the body of the soil. So do not amend the soil or add fertilizer when you're planting fruit trees. Okay, so I think we have a poll. I'm going to just move on to our next. We're going to talk about mulch next, but I think we have a poll that we want to put up that asks you, tries to get you to remember which are the situations where you should amend your clay soil with compost. You can check as many as you think are correct.
All right, the poll looks great. It's most people answered in vegetable beds and when planting annual flowers such as marigolds, sunflowers, and violas.
Great, you guys are great. Thank you for your attention. That shows that you've been definitely listening. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about mulch. We're just going to spend a few minutes on this, a few minutes on cover crops, and then we will wrap this up and take more questions. So a mulch, just a second, I've got to get rid of my thingy here. This poll keeps coming back. I'm not sure why. Okay. Mulch is anything that you put on top of the soil, only on top of the soil to protect the surface of the soil. And we, as master gardeners, we encourage you to use an organic mulch. That means a mulch that's made out of plant material. Plant or animal material, but basically plant material. So it could be bark. It could be wood chips, arborist chips, the free chips that you get from tree work. It could be leaves, dead leaves. It could be pine needles. It should just be something that you're comfortable working around because it's going to be on the ground around your plants for a long time. In the vegetable garden, you might want to use something, you do want to use something that's either easy to get off when it's time to redig your beds and get them ready for the next season, or you would use something that you could mix into your soil when you're getting ready, like compost. So around your vegetables, you could use a compost mulch. The mulch should go on top of your irrigation, so that if it's at all possible, if you're hand irrigating or you're overhead irrigating, you're going to have to go on top of your mulch. But hopefully you can make some kind of arrangement where you have your mulch on top of the irrigation. Otherwise, your irrigation has to get your mulch all wet before it can start getting into the soil to irrigate your plants. But you can use any of that kind of material and it's going to stay there permanently. It will slowly decay. And because it's made of plant material, it will slowly add nutrients at that surface. The real purpose of mulch, though, the nutrients are a nice little bonus, but it's pretty slow. But the real purpose of mulch is to protect the surface of the soil. So what does it protect it from? It protects it from beating sun, from heavy rain, from wind, from anything that can actually carry your soil off or force it to run off or whatever. So you would mulch thickly enough to protect it in that way. In the winter, it can in winter or summer, it can also kind of regulate the temperature of the soil. So in the summer, it keeps that surface a little cooler when the sun is beating down and it might be too hot for your plants if there's no mulch. In the winter, it can actually keep the soil warmer because it's kind of an insulating blanket on top of it. You can use non-plant material for mulch. Some people use plastic sheeting or even gravel. Just be sure that if you use something like that, it's something that isn't going to interfere with your gardening practices. But anything that is put down to protect the surface of the soil that is not dug into the soil, but only put down on the surface, that is a mulch. And it is good to mulch everything because it makes your irrigation more efficient if your irrigation is underneath there. But even if it goes through, once it's through, the mulch will keep that water in the soil rather than having it evaporate out. So it's a good idea to do it for all your plants. If you have woody plants, trees or woody shrubs, you want to keep the mulch back away from the trunk of that plant because it would hold moisture there. And we just talked about why moisture in the root crown area is something that we don't want. So do keep the mulch at least 6 inches to a foot back from the trunk of anything like a tree or a woody shrub. Okay. The other thing that you can do to protect your soil is to plant cover crops. So I mentioned this earlier, and here we are to talk about them a little bit. So a cover crop is anything that you plant to protect your soil rather than to harvest. So it's it can be something permanent, like you see on the lower left there. That's actually a grassy roadway, but in an orchard. And they've put that grass in as a permanent mulch there, probably to keep dust down in that orchard. And up above, you see a picture of blooming crimson clover. And crimson clover is one that appeals to a lot of people because it has these beautiful blooms. But I'm here to tell you that if you use it as a cover crop, you should be turning it in before it blooms like that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And on the left is a vetch. Clover and vetch are both in the legume family. And so these are some of those plants that I mentioned earlier that grow and actually are able to take nitrogen from the air that's in the soil. I mean, it's because there's air in the pore spaces in the soil. They take that air and they get the nitrogen from that air and they turn it into forms of nitrogen that the plant can use. This is done by bacteria that live in a symbiotic relationship with the plant on the roots of the plant. So these bacteria live in colonies on the roots of the plant. And they are they are able to take that nitrogen out of the air spaces in the soil, turn it into plant available nitrogen and feed it into the plant. So the plant doesn't need to be fertilized. It's essentially through its bacterial friends making its own fertilizer. Okay, so legumes do this: beans, peas, vetches, clovers. These are the types of plants that are able to do that. So if you use that kind of a plant, the cover crop that you're growing, we call a green manure, because it's as though you're going to be able to put manure on as a nitrogen source from that actual plant body. This is a picture of blooming fava beans. Fava beans are very popular as a cover crop with vegetable gardeners because a lot of people like fava beans to eat. Again, if you eat the fava beans, you are getting all the nitrogen that the bacteria on the roots of this plant worked so hard to fix. So you can save a few fava beans for yourself, but really, if you are growing a legume as a green manure, as a cover crop that is intended to be a green manure, you are going to chop down that plant when it is starting to bloom, because that is the point at which there is the maximum amount of nitrogen in the plant that has been fixed, that has been channeled into that plant. And you're going to chop it down and cut it up and turn it into the soil. Yes, that is some work to do. If you do it at the right time, if you don't let the favas get, if you really do it when you see them starting to bloom instead of letting them get really tall, it's not quite as hard. Or you could use other plants that are not as big, not as huge as favas. So what you get out of this is not just that nitrogen that was fixed from the air, which means you didn't have to pay for the fertilizer, it's there, but you also get all the organic matter that is in these living plants. So when you chop it up and turn the soil over on it so that it's kind of roughly buried in the soil, it's not pretty, it doesn't have to be perfect. This is a picture of crimson clover that has been turned in, and you can see it's not perfectly turned in, but mostly it's buried. Then those plants will rot away in the soil by the action of those bacteria and fungi that live in the soil. And as their plants, as they are consumed by those microscopic organisms, there's a whole chain of a food web that is initiated that ends up with those bacteria dying and giving off the nitrogen to the soil. So in about 3 to 5 weeks after you have turned those plants into the soil in the spring, they will be gone and the nitrogen will be in your soil waiting for you to plant your summer vegetables. You can also do summer cover crops. There are summer cover crops. So if you ever have a bed in your vegetable garden that you are planning not to put anything in, you should at least grow a summer cover crop, because cover crops have all the same advantages as mulches. They protect the surface of the soil from beating sun, from wind, from heavy rain. They prevent erosion. They draw out water if the soil is waterlogged. You know that if we have tremendous rains and the soil just can't drain that water out fast enough, it can become anaerobic. That is, that all the pore spaces can fill up with water. We don't want that. We want half the pore space with water and half the pore space with air. So plants draw the water out of the soil. So just having a standing crop is a way of ensuring even if the winter rains are heavy, that our soils don't get completely waterlogged. So there are tremendous advantages to growing cover crops at all times of year. The summer cover crops, I mentioned the winter ones, fava beans, legumes, vetches, clovers, these are all winter cover crops. Summer cover crops are soybean, which is sometimes a little difficult to get started, but cowpeas. Cowpeas grow like crazy. They take very little water. They're a legume, and so they're a nitrogen fixing cover crop that you can grow in the summer anytime. Buckwheat is another popular summer cover crop. It grows very rapidly. You can probably cut it down 3 or 4 times in a summer season. So you get a lot of organic matter out of buckwheat, but it is not a legume, so it will not add nitrogen. You will need to fertilize in order for your buckwheat to do well. Okay, so I think we are closing in on our time here. So I want to get a little feedback from you. I want to thank you for being with us. And I want to see, we are going to answer some questions here. So I know that Edith has been watching the chat to see if there's some questions, and I will start answering those. But I also wanted to get some of you working on this. There are 3 things that I would like to know that will help me evaluate whether this class had the right content. I'd like to know if there is something you learned about clay soil that you didn't know before. And if you want to type this into the chat, if you just put 1 and then you type something you learned about clay soil that you didn't know before, I'll know that you're trying to answer this particular question. The second one that I would like to know is something that we discussed tonight that you really intend to try to apply in your garden. So that would be number 2. And number 3 would be questions that you still have about tonight's topic that we just haven't gotten to, because that will tell me what people really wanted to hear about that we weren't able to get to. So if you would be willing to try to answer some of those questions, I'll see if Edith has any other questions that she's fished out of the chat.
Yes, we have quite a few. The first question, fairly early. Is it necessary to keep soil watered at all times, even if certain sections are not planted?
No, it is not. There is a whole soil food web. I'm sure you have read about it. It's very, very well known now. So there are animals that live in the soil, and there are There are a lot of microscopic organisms that are in the soil that are absolutely essential to healthy soil. I've mentioned some of their functions tonight, just sideways here. So if you let a garden bed go completely dry, the macroscopic animals will find another way. You know, the earthworms will dive deep, or pill bugs and earwigs, which, by the way, have beneficial effects in the garden. I know you think of them as undesirables, but they actually do good things in the garden. They will go elsewhere and survive elsewhere. The microbes, of course, can't do that, but it would take a lot to actually kill the microscopic life. So I am going a little bit out of my expertise here, but I do not believe that a season without water in our soil, in our type of soil, will destroy that part of the food web. If it could, I don't think we would have that food web anymore. So.
Okay, then we have some questions about compost. What can I use, rabbit manure or worm casting instead of compost?
Okay, so let's start with worm castings. Worm castings are essentially compost that has been processed by earthworms instead of just sitting in a pile somewhere. And you definitely can use them. They are a little higher in nitrogen than regular compost, but not as much as you might think. But they are somewhat higher, and they have a different consistency, as you've noticed if you have worm castings. If you're thinking about buying them, they would be a lot more expensive to use than compost. And but if you have a line on a free supply of all the worm castings you could possibly use, yes, of course you could use those instead of compost, and you wouldn't need as much of them, but you'd still need quite a lot if you were counting on it to amend your clay soil. And the other one was rabbit manure. And yes, it's best to compost manure before you add it to your garden. So put it in a pile somewhere and let it just compost for, a few months on its own, and then you can add it. It's really, I can't off the top of my head remember what rabbit manure is in terms of nitrogen content, but it's certainly got more nitrogen in it than plant-based compost. I'm going to guess that it might be, if you had enough of it, it could even serve as your fertilizer.
Okay. And what do you think of mushroom compost?
Mushroom compost, meaning getting it from the people that grow mushrooms commercially?
Yes.
I don't know if there are any cons to using that or not. If it's just plain old, I think it's sterilized compost. So it won't add any microbes to the soil. I think they sterilize it because they have to sterilize it so they only get the mushrooms that they want. And so it wouldn't add any microbes to the soil as you might get in typically the cold compost that most of us, the slow compost that most of us make. But in terms of organic matter and the effect on the structure of the soil, it would be fine.
Okay, and then is chicken manure the best animal manure to use in terms of the highest in nitrogen?
It is higher in nitrogen than steer manure or horse manure. It's around, it depends on whether you're talking wet or dry, but it's around, if you buy a bag in the garden centers, it'll tell you what the percentage is, and I think it's around 5%, 4 or 5%, something like that. Whereas horse and steer are 1% and 2% usually. So yeah, it is. I don't know about, yeah, it's definitely higher than steer or horse.
Okay, great. And then what about soil acidity? Do most gardeners need to worry about it? Do they need to check the pH of their soil?
So this is another place in which we can give thanks for our wonderful Santa Clara County clay soil. The pH of this soil is in the neutral range. It's in the 7 to slightly higher than 7. And it turns out that that's the pH that most nutrients are the most available to vegetables and other plants. There are specific plants, as I'm sure you know, that need a much lower pH soil. Acid-loving plants, we refer to them as. They need a soil that the pH is down around. Blueberries, for example, are happiest if it's down in the 4 to 5 range. And it is pretty darn hard to get our clay soil down to that range. You have to use either heavily use peat moss, which is acidic, and use soil sulfur as an amendment in appropriate amounts to get the pH of our clay soil down that far. But for vegetables and for most of the Mediterranean plants that we grow and the California natives, the pH is just right here.
Great. I'm going to ask just 2 more questions because we're a little bit past 8:30.
Okay.
One is, do cover crops loosen the soil? Somebody would like to improve their soil without having to do any digging. Yeah.
Okay. So without doing any digging is pretty darn hard. You might want to look into hiring someone to do the digging. Cover crops create channels in the soil with their roots. And they do, root action can kind of help form that granular structure that we're talking about by kind of pushing the clay around a little bit. But if you think about the size of the roots that you pull out when you're growing herbaceous plants like cover crops, they're not big enough to really, quote, dig the soil. But as you saw tonight, simply catching it at the right moisture means that it's not going to be too difficult to dig. The initial digging in order to incorporate the compost so that it doesn't go back into that mass is very hard to escape in a vegetable garden. There is some talk of using daikon radish. Some people say, daikon radish grows really deep down in the soil, and it's a long and thick radish, and it will break up the soil. But breaking it up enough to have that loose granular structure that you want for vegetables, I don't think you're going to be able to accomplish that with plants.
Okay, great. And the last question I'm going to give you this evening is it okay to plant vegetables all year round by just adding compost and fertilizer between crops?
Yes, it is. In fact, we encourage you to do that. And a lot of us do that. So I always kid that there's about 1 week in January where there's nothing to do in the garden. And all the rest of the time you're behind. Because there's no reason why you can't grow vegetables year round here, as long as you remember to renew the soil with a little bit of compost and on an ongoing basis, and putting in the fertilizer that your plants are going to need in order to thrive. So absolutely, yes, you just keep growing year round.
Great. And I just want to, so that's the conclusion of our presentation.
Edith, this is Sharon.
Yes, Sharon.
Can I pop in for just a second?
Yes.
I just wanted to note for Candace that Michael or Michelle, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name, made a couple of comments in the chat, and I wanted to point them out for Candace to get her reaction.
Okay.
So the first was that some fertilizers can cause neurological damage. They're citing materials data, safety data sheets. I just wanted to get, especially from big agricultural operations, I just wanted to get your comment about that.
I don't think, I am not qualified to comment on that. I am a chemist by training, But you know, a lot of things I don't know. I would have to know the dosage. I certainly, if you, the fertilizers that are available to home gardeners, any chemical, if you're choosing to use chemical fertilizers, you need to use them exactly as directed. This is something that we usually only get questions about with pesticides, where it's the danger is obvious. With fertilizers, as I said, used as directed, stored as directed, handled as directed. I don't know of any available to home gardeners that would cause those kinds of problems. Certainly, if you ignored all those directions and exposed yourself in unexpected ways, ingestion, et cetera, I can imagine that there would be damage. But then, I don't have any exact information about that.
Yeah, and if I could just say again what you said earlier, which is always use any packaged materials as directed.
Right.
So look them up, do your homework on anything you're putting into your garden. Yeah. This person also provided a list of the worst and best types of fertilizers. He or she said it was from Growing Your Greens on YouTube. I just wanted to point out, if you have any questions, and Candace, please add to this. If you have any questions on these issues, please go to the Master Gardener website, where we can help you get information from the University of California. There's a lot of information out there on the web, and it is interesting, but there's a lot of homework to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Sharon, for that.
Yeah, thanks so much.
That's quite good. One other thing I wanted to mention, if we still have anybody hanging in there with us, is that the university does evaluate the work of the master gardeners. And one of the things that they're always interested in is whether the public education things that we do actually provide information to homeowners, to gardeners, home gardeners, who that they can use in their gardens, and that they do use in their gardens. It's nice to talk, but the whole idea is to try to help people with something that is useful to them. So after we do a talk like this, you will get an email about 3 months from now from the University Evaluation Program reminding you that you were in this class and asking you a few questions about whether you were able to actually use any of the information. This is an evaluation of us and what we choose to share with the public, and it is not an evaluation of you and what you do with the information. It is to see whether master gardeners are making the right choices about the classes that they give and the information that they share. So if you get that email in the future, I hope that you will answer honestly and help us out to improve these kinds of programs.
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you so much, everybody, for attending. And if you need any more information, please visit our website or check out our videos on the YouTube channel, or send an email to our help desk with any questions about your personal garden. So I just want to say thank you again to Candace for an amazing presentation, and thanks to the Palo Alto Library for co-sponsoring this event. And again, to all of you for your questions and for attending the presentation. Take care and happy gardening.
Great. Thank you, everybody.